10 years of grinding behind a screen, eating meals straight out of plastic containers, and surviving on caffeine and ambition had finally paid off. I had built my software company from the ashes of layoffs and rejection letters, teaching myself to code in the corners of coffee shops and 24-hour libraries, refusing to give up even when people told me to get a real job. Now I was standing in the driveway of my new home in Maple Ridge Hills, watching a transport truck gently lower a gleaming cherry-red Lamborghini Huracan Evo onto the pavement. My hands trembled slightly as I signed the delivery papers, not from nerves, but from surreal disbelief that this moment had finally arrived. The sun hit the car's paint just right, sending a ripple of reflection across the perfectly polished surface. It looked less like a vehicle and more like something summoned from a dream. This wasn't just a car. It was the first thing I had ever done purely for myself. Not for survival, not for my company, not for my parents. Just for me. As I walked around the car, I heard the familiar crunch of gravel from across the street. I turned to see Karen, my neighbor, standing at the edge of her lawn, hands on her hips, lips drawn into a tight, disapproving line. Her adult son Stephen stood a few steps behind her, wearing sagging pajama pants with cartoon dragons on them and an oversized T-shirt with a suspicious orange stain right in the middle. He stared at the Lamborghini like it was a portal to another world. Karen narrowed her eyes at me like I'd committed some kind of violation by simply existing. We'd had minimal interaction since I moved in 6 weeks ago, just a wave here or a fake smile there, but I had felt the cold air whenever she passed me on the street, and it didn't take a genius to read what she thought. I was new, I was younger than the average homeowner here, and I didn't fit her template of what a good neighbor should look like. As I finished admiring the curves of the car, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. I turned just as Karen stopped at the edge of my driveway, dragging Stephen along like a reluctant toddler. He was at least in his 30s, if not older, but carried himself like a teenager forced to go somewhere against his will. I greeted them with a friendly smile, hoping to finally break the weird tension between us. Karen didn't return the gesture. "So this is yours?" she asked, her voice already soaked in judgment. "It is," I said proudly, wiping a small invisible speck off the windshield. "Just got it delivered. Been saving for a long time." Karen raised one eyebrow. "Interesting. I didn't realize our neighborhood was zoned for exotic vehicles. They tend to attract attention." I paused for a second. I wasn't aware that exotic cars were a problem. I read the HOA manual twice before moving in. There's no restriction on vehicle type. "There are other kinds of restrictions," she said, looking at the car like it had just insulted her flower beds. "Unspoken ones, about keeping things modest, balanced, respectful." Stephen's eyes hadn't left the car once. His mouth hung open slightly, and he looked like he was somewhere between hypnotized and physically ill with jealousy. Finally, he spoke. "Dude, this is a Huracan Evo, right? V10 engine, 600 plus horsepower." I nodded, caught off guard by his sudden shift in tone. "That's insane," he whispered, almost reverently. "I've been saving pictures of this exact model since high school." I smiled politely. "It's a beast for sure." Stephen turned to his mom with a desperate expression. "Can I get one too? For my birthday or something?" Karen scoffed like he had asked for a spaceship. "You'll get one once you find stable employment and a sense of responsibility." I couldn't help but notice the irony, considering Stephen was still living with her and spent most of his time watching N9 or arguing about video game updates on his porch phone calls. I had seen him lounging outside at all hours, smoking cheap vapes and shouting at his screen, hardly the profile of someone about to secure a Lambo. Karen looked back at me. "You'll find that people around here don't appreciate showmanship. We prefer quiet living, family values. Your car doesn't exactly represent that." I tilted my head slightly, choosing to respond with calm. "I worked very hard for this. It's the first real reward I've given myself after 10 years of building a company. I plan to drive it respectfully and responsibly." Karen gave a tight smile. "Well, let's just hope that respect is mutual. It would be a shame if your time here started with friction." She turned on her heel and walked back toward her house, muttering something to Stephen, who followed behind reluctantly, throwing one last longing glance over his shoulder at the Lamborghini. I stood there for a few seconds, processing the interaction. It had started strange, dipped into passive aggression, and ended in veiled threat territory. Not exactly a warm neighborhood welcome. The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper stuffed in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, Karen's signature at the bottom. The note suggested that my car may be in violation of aesthetic harmony and that a formal review could be initiated if further concerns arise from the community. There was no official seal, no date stamp, nothing binding, just an intimidation attempt. I walked back inside and sat at my dining table, staring at the note. I could feel the slow simmer of irritation building in my chest, but I reminded myself to keep calm. People like Karen thrived on confrontation. They needed someone to explode so they could play the victim. Instead of reacting emotionally, I began documenting everything. I took photos of the note, the timestamp on my mailbox camera, and noted down our conversation from the day before. I wasn't sure where this was heading, but I had a bad feeling that Karen and Stephen weren't done, not by a long shot. Later that day, I spotted Stephen again, this time crouched behind one of the shrubs lining their driveway, peeking through the bushes. His phone was out, and it looked like he was filming my car. When our eyes met, he ducked awkwardly, pretending to check the soil or something equally ridiculous. I didn't say anything. I just watched him scramble inside like a raccoon caught in the trash. That night, as I sat in my garage staring at my Lamborghini, I couldn't shake the feeling that this car had triggered something far bigger than jealousy. It had sparked entitlement, delusion, maybe even obsession. And it wasn't just Stephen. Karen seemed just as invested in controlling how I lived, what I owned, and how I existed in this carefully manicured community. I had worked hard to escape the chaos of the city and move into a peaceful neighborhood, but peace apparently was not something Karen Thompson planned to offer. The following morning, I stepped out onto my driveway with a coffee mug in hand, intending to enjoy a few quiet moments before diving into my workday. The sun was warm, birds chirped from the nearby trees, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed calm. That was until I spotted Stephen standing just outside his front door, his phone aimed squarely at my car. He wasn't being subtle about it either, zooming in, walking in small circles around the edge of his lawn, muttering what sounded like commentary. I set my mug on the hood of the car and walked a few steps forward, not saying a word. Stephen immediately jerked his head up, startled like a kid caught with his hand in a cookie jar, and scurried back inside without so much as a wave. I shook my head and muttered under my breath. This wasn't obsession anymore. It was starting to look like surveillance, and it didn't take long for the next move in their bizarre little campaign to arrive. By noon, a formal-looking letter was slid under my front door. It had the HOA logo, albeit printed in low resolution, and was signed by none other than Karen herself. It claimed that my vehicle had received multiple complaints from anonymous neighbors about excessive engine noise and disruptive aesthetics. The language was vague and deliberately intimidating, using words like non-compliance, decorum breach, and visual aggression. According to the letter, I had 1 week to remedy the disruption or face a formal review by the HOA disciplinary board. I read it 3 times, mostly in disbelief. Visual aggression. Was this a neighborhood or a kindergarten classroom? Rather than react in anger, I made a few calls. First to the HOA itself, where I learned from a bored-sounding receptionist that there had been no official complaint logged in the system. Second, I called my attorney and forwarded him a scanned copy of the letter. He reviewed it and confirmed it was unenforceable, stating flatly that Karen's position on the board didn't give her unilateral authority to threaten residents with policy violations that didn't exist. I thanked him, then sat quietly for a minute. It was clear now. Karen was using her place on the board to try and pressure me out, or at least punish me for not conforming to her version of suburban life. It was a power play disguised as protocol. That evening, I decided I wasn't going to sit back and let this continue unchecked. I walked door to every house on my street, introducing myself properly, asking if they had submitted a noise complaint, and gently sharing that I believed Karen was misusing her role in the HOA. Every neighbor I spoke to denied filing any complaint. In fact, many of them admitted they had grown tired of Karen's behavior over the years. The Hendersons, 2 doors down, told me how she'd once tried to fine them for having wind chimes. The Nguyen family had been warned about their Halloween decorations being too thematic. Even Dr. Carlson, a retired Navy officer, recounted the time Karen demanded he remove his flagpole because flags disrupt visual continuity. A picture was forming. Karen wasn't just difficult with me. She'd been running her own little dictatorship for years, and no one had challenged her. That night, I scored the HOA bylaws. To my surprise, I found that the HOA board elections were scheduled to take place in just 4 weeks. I found a clause that allowed any homeowner in good standing to submit candidacy with a simple petition signed by 5 residents. I printed it out, filled in my name, and walked it back to the same neighbors who had shared their stories. Within 24 hours, I had 12 signatures. I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to take the reins. If Karen thought her title made her untouchable, she was about to learn otherwise. 2 days later, I was in my garage polishing the car when Stephen came stumbling across the street, holding what looked like a cheap microphone and a smartphone clipped to a selfie stick. He walked right up to my driveway, turned to face the camera, and began talking loudly. "Yo, what's up, guys? It's your boy Stephen, and today we're doing a neighborhood review. This dude behind me just bought a Lambo, and we're going to see if it's real or just a rented flex." I blinked twice, unsure whether I was more confused or annoyed. He turned the camera to me and said, "Hey man, mind telling the people what you do for a living?" "You know, for the vlog." I raised an eyebrow and replied flatly, "Stephen, I'm not interested in being on your channel." He laughed awkwardly. "Come on, man, don't be like that. The internet loves stories like this. Guy from nowhere moves in with a supercar. It's inspirational." "It's invasive," I said, "and you didn't ask." He lowered the stick slowly. "Whatever, dude. You think you're better than everyone just 'cause you've got a fancy car. My mom says you're just flaunting it to humiliate us. We were here first, you know." "That doesn't give you the right to harass me," I said, stepping between him and the vehicle. "Now go home, Stephen." He stared at me for a long moment before slinking away, muttering something about gatekeeping wealth under his breath. I watched him go, the back of his shirt stained with sweat, his pajama pants dragging in the gravel. I felt a strange mix of pity and irritation. Stephen wasn't the real problem. He was a puppet. His mother was the hand pulling the strings. 3 days passed with no further incidents until I received another letter, this one real, delivered by certified mail from the HOA headquarters. Karen had called an emergency meeting of the board, citing a disturbance of community cohesion and public concern over neighborhood harmony. I knew exactly what this was, a public ambush. She intended to use the meeting as a stage to discredit me, perhaps even stir up support from confused or intimidated residents. I wasn't about to let that happen. I showed up to the meeting prepared. I wore a sharp suit, had copies of my compliance records, statements from supportive neighbors, and even brought my lawyer to observe. The room was fuller than expected. Nearly 24 residents had shown up, many of whom had likely never attended a board meeting before. Karen sat at the head of the table, dressed in pink as always, her expression smug and self-satisfied. She cleared her throat and opened with a speech about protecting the integrity of the neighborhood, peppered with loaded language about flashy displays and outside elements. Then she gestured toward me. "We believe Mr. Carter's presence, though technically compliant, has introduced an unsettling energy to our streets. His vehicle choices and behavior have caused discomfort to long-standing residents, particularly my son, who suffers from environmental sensitivity." I stood, adjusted my collar, and calmly refuted every point. I presented evidence of my compliance, my respectful behavior, and the false nature of the anonymous complaints. Then I handed the board my petition to run for HOA president, signed and dated. The fallout from the HOA meeting was instant and electrifying. Word spread through the neighborhood like a match to dry brush. I received text messages and knocks on my door from residents I hadn't even met yet. some thanking me for standing up to Karen, others offering their support for the upcoming election. A few even confessed they'd been afraid to speak out in the past, worried they'd be targeted next if they crossed her. It was strange realizing how much power one woman had accumulated through fear and gossip. But the tide was turning. I hadn't even been on the ballot for 24 hours, and already the support was growing faster than I expected. Karen, however, wasn't finished. If anything, the meeting had triggered a fresh wave of desperation in her. The next morning, I opened my garage to find a crumpled fast food bag smashed against the hood of my Lamborghini. It smelled like sour ketchup and pickles. Taped to the windshield with Scotch tape was a crudely written note on lined notebook paper that said, "Enjoy your garbage car, poser." I didn't need a handwriting analyst to know it was Stevens. The letters were bubble-like and slightly tilted, with the S written backward. I peeled it off and tossed everything in a trash bag. I didn't bother confronting them. I had bigger plans, and I wasn't going to let petty nonsense throw me off. That afternoon, I called a few local businesses, catering, tent rentals, speakers, and a few classic car owners I'd met through forums. I told them I was planning something special, something bold. If Karen wanted to control the neighborhood through whispers and intimidation, I was going to answer with volume and celebration. I scheduled a community gathering in my own driveway the following weekend, called it a Neighborhood Appreciation Day, and sent personalized invites to every house on the block, including hers. I hired a food truck to serve free tacos, booked a bounce house for the kids, and even arranged for a string quartet to play some elegant background music. It wasn't about flaunting wealth. It was about redefining what this neighborhood could be. Friendly, fun, open. Karen had built a kingdom of silence. I was going to replace it with the sound of laughter and music. But before the weekend arrived, she struck again. Late one night, I checked my security app and caught movement on my front camera. Stephen was crouched near my car, his face barely visible under a hoodie. He appeared to be pouring something out of a plastic container. I rushed to the garage and flipped the outdoor lights on, but he had already run back across the street. In the morning, I saw what he had done. A large greasy X had been poured across my front lawn. I knelt down, touched the grass, and confirmed it was motor oil. The stain was spreading, the grass already browning beneath the black liquid. I didn't even bother yelling. I called the police, then forwarded the video to my attorney. By noon, an officer had stopped by and filed a formal report. Stephen had made a mistake. He didn't cover his face properly. His pale features were visible for several frames, and he was wearing the same hoodie I had seen him wear for days. Karen came outside while the officer was still parked in my driveway, but she didn't say a word. She stood on her porch with her arms crossed, glaring at me like I was the one who had trespassed. I met her gaze with calm indifference. The next day, it got worse. My mailbox was shattered. A wooden bat lay on the sidewalk nearby, the handle wrapped in electrical tape. My camera had captured everything again. Stephen, under the cover of night, marching across the street like some suburban vigilant and smashing the box in 2 strokes. In the background, Karen's SUV was idling at the curb, headlights off. She was waiting for him. I added the footage to my case file and replaced the mailbox with a metal one bolted into a concrete post. It wasn't about the money. It was about making a statement. You could swing all you wanted, but I wasn't going anywhere. The day of the neighborhood event arrived under clear skies and bright sun. I wore a polo shirt and jeans, casual but neat, and spent the morning helping set up tents and organizing folding chairs. The food truck arrived right on time, its bright yellow body instantly attracting families. Neighbors began arriving slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Children ran to the bounce house, squealing with delight. Couples mingled near the snack tables, and the soft hum of violins filled the air. People laughed, complimented the setup, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a sense of real community. I had parked the Lamborghini in the center of the driveway, not as a trophy, but as a centerpiece, clean, polished, gleaming. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of perseverance, of rising above judgment. Neighbors took pictures beside it, asked polite questions, and respected boundaries. Dr. Garland from 4 houses down told me his grandson had a poster of the same model on his bedroom wall. Mrs. Nguyen brought homemade dumplings and thanked me for standing up to the Pink Menace, a nickname I didn't realize Karen had earned. Around midday, I saw Karen standing at the edge of her property, arms folded, face unreadable. Stephen stood next to her, sulking in a black hoodie, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. They weren't mingling. They weren't eating tacos. They were watching. I caught her eye and gave a small nod. She turned her head sharply and walked back into her house. Stephen lingered a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the Lamborghini, then followed her. Later that evening, after the last folding table was packed away and the bounce house deflated, I sat on the porch with a soda in hand, watching the sunset. My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors, all thanking me. One read, "Best event this place has had in years." Another said, "You've already done more than the HOA ever did." It felt like victory, but I knew better than to celebrate too early. People like Karen didn't accept change gracefully. They fought until their grip was gone, then tried to poison the air as they left. I had seen it before in business, in boardrooms, and life. I was ready for whatever she tried next, but what I didn't expect was the visit that came 3 days later. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, my doorbell rang with the kind of urgency that never brought good news. I opened the door to find Stephen standing there alone, his eyes bloodshot, his body jittery with what looked like desperation. He shifted from foot to foot like he was working up the nerve to ask for a kidney. "Hey," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "I know this is weird, but can I talk to you for a second?" I raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, gesturing him in. He shook his head. No, I'll stay out here. Just, can you do me a favor?" "What kind of favor?" I asked carefully. He looked over his shoulder to make sure Karen wasn't watching. Then he leaned in and whispered like we were exchanging state secrets. Can I drive your Lambo? Just once. Around the block? I've never even sat in one. I swear I'll be careful." The days after Stephen's request felt eerily quiet, as though the calm was only a thin layer stretched over something festering beneath. I went about my routines, but I never let my guard down. Each morning I scanned my cameras, checked my lawn, and inspected the Lamborghini like a parent watching over a sleeping child. Karen's silence was the most suspicious thing of all. For someone who thrived on confrontation and public drama, her withdrawal could only mean one thing: she was planning something. I just didn't expect her next move to come in the form of raw, unfiltered insanity. It started early on a Thursday morning. I was sipping coffee in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. Motion detected in driveway. I checked the live feed and froze. Stephen was outside again, this time holding a crowbar. Karen stood at the edge of the lawn, wearing another one of her overly tight pink blazers, pacing back and forth like she was orchestrating a crime scene. Stephen approached the passenger side of the car, knelt down, and attempted to wedge the crowbar under the door handle. I dropped my mug. It shattered across the floor as I grabbed my keys and bolted outside, but I wasn't fast enough. Stephen had already popped the door open, his face lit with the kind of deranged satisfaction that only comes from believing he deserved what he was stealing. Karen shouted, "Hurry, just start it. He's coming." But Stephen didn't get far. The moment he tried to hit the ignition, the engine refused to start. The security system locked him out completely, flooding the interior with a flashing red warning that read, "Unauthorized access detected." I had installed a kill switch weeks ago, connected directly to my phone, and now I activated the horn remotely. A deafening blast rang out. Stephen screamed and scrambled backward, stumbling out of the car with his arms flailing. Karen dashed toward him, yelling at me, "This is harassment. You tricked us. You set us up." I stared at her, stunned by the complete lack of shame. "You broke into my car," I said, voice low and shaking with fury. "You're lucky I didn't call the police already." Her face twisted. "He just wanted a ride. You've been parading that thing like it's a trophy. If you weren't flaunting it so hard, he wouldn't have felt this way. You provoked him." I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped. There was nothing I could say to a person like her. Logic was a language she didn't understand. Instead, I tapped a button on my phone. My screen showed the footage from 3 different camera angles. Stephen breaking in, Karen giving orders. Her face paled. "You recorded this?" "I record everything," I replied, "for situations just like this." That night, I forwarded the footage to my attorney and the police. By morning, an officer came by to take my statement. I was told that charges for attempted theft and property damage were being processed, but it would take a few days. I nodded, thanked him, and returned inside. I felt a little relief, but mostly fatigue. It wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about control. Karen had lost hers, and she was lashing out like a cornered animal. 2 days later, the storm broke. I had a business meeting in the city and was just getting ready to leave when I opened the garage to find Karen and Stephen blocking my driveway again. They stood like sentinels, arms crossed, their bodies stiff with theatrical resolve. I stared at them through the windshield for a few seconds, then stepped out calmly. "You need to move. I have somewhere to be." Karen didn't flinch. "We need to talk about compensation." I blinked. "Compensation?" "Yes," she said firmly, "for the emotional trauma you've inflicted on our family. Stephen's therapist says his anxiety has gotten worse since your vehicle appeared in front of our house." Stephen nodded, clearly rehearsed. "Every night I hear that engine in my nightmares. It's like a missile going off. I haven't been able to sleep. My dreams are just revving sounds and humiliation." Karen took a step closer. "We believe it's only fair that you offer us something in return. Either sell us the car at a reduced price, 70% off would be reasonable, or allow Stephen to use it a few days a week." I stared at them in stunned silence. My first instinct was to laugh, but I didn't. I knew any reaction other than dead seriousness would only escalate things. "You think I should give you my car after you vandalized my lawn, smashed my mailbox, broke into it with a crowbar, and now blocked my driveway?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "You call it vandalism. We call it justice. You disrupted the balance of this neighborhood. We've been here for 20 years. You can't just roll in here with your flashy toys and act like you own the place." Stephen mumbled, "You don't even understand. That car should be mine. It's not fair. I manifested it." Karen nodded. "Exactly. He's been visualizing that model for months. The universe delivered it to the wrong person." I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not disgust. Something colder, like a thread of steel snapping into place. I pulled out my phone and made a single call. "Officer Peterson?" I said, keeping my eyes locked on Karen. "They are trespassing on my property again. You remember the case file?" "Yes, it's them again." Karen's expression faltered for the first time. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You can't call the police just because we're talking." "This isn't a conversation," I replied. "You're obstructing my property, and you've already been warned." A few minutes later, the familiar black and white cruiser pulled up. Officer Peterson stepped out, her notebook already in hand. "Ma'am, sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move. Mr. Carter has filed multiple reports. You are in violation of trespassing laws." Karen's voice cracked. "You don't understand. He's turning the neighborhood against us." Stephen burst out, "You're on his side because of the car, right? Everyone just loves rich people." Officer Peterson remained stoic. "I'm on the side of the law, Mr. Thompson, and right now, the law says you need to step off his driveway." Karen glared at me one last time. "This isn't over." I said nothing. She turned and stormed off, dragging Stephen by the sleeve. As they disappeared into their house, I took a deep breath and turned back to Officer Peterson. "Thank you," I said. "I'm doing everything right, and they just keep pushing." She gave me a small nod. "Keep documenting. It's building a solid case." That night, I walked the length of my house, checking every lock, every camera, every sensor. I double-checked the kill switch in the car and reviewed every minute of recorded footage. I didn't want to believe it would escalate again, but I knew better. Karen had declared war, and people like her didn't retreat with grace. They escalated, they self-destructed, they dragged others down with them. But I was ready now. I had drawn my line, and I wasn't backing down. They had tried noise complaints, lies, vandalism, guilt trips, and now emotional blackmail. None of it worked. They were running out of plays. The only question now was how far they were willing to go, and how loud they'd scream when it all finally blew up in their faces. It was early Saturday morning when the final act of this ongoing circus unfolded, and it came not with a bang, but with a ridiculous sense of entitlement dressed up as one last desperate demand. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when I heard the familiar sound of my doorbell ringing, not the casual press, but that frantic, non-stop ringing that made it feel more like an alarm than a visitor. I checked my camera feed and almost laughed. Karen and Stephen were on my porch again, both looking unusually polished. Stephen wore a collared shirt, though it was wrinkled, and his chalky pants looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. Karen, unsurprisingly, was draped in yet another pink ensemble, this one with gold accents and shoulder pads that looked like relics from the 80s. I opened the door cautiously, expecting more complaints or maybe another bizarre claim of spiritual car ownership. But what they wanted this time managed to surprise even me. Karen began speaking immediately, her tone firm and theatrical, as if she were delivering a rehearsed speech to a crowd. She said they had spoken to their attorney, though knowing Karen, that could have meant a friend's cousin who watched legal dramas, and were prepared to issue a formal notice of neighborhood distress, unless I addressed the psychological damage I had caused her son. Stephen stood beside her, nodding dramatically, clutching what appeared to be a printed screenshot of my Lamborghini's Instagram tag, which I had never even posted. I asked calmly what exactly they were after now, and Karen laid it all out in that condescending tone that always made her sound like she was scolding a classroom of toddlers. She said Stephen had reached a breaking point emotionally, and that I had an opportunity to do the decent neighborly thing by making amends. When I asked what she meant by amends, she didn't even hesitate. According to her, I had two choices. I could either agree to sell them the Lamborghini for what she called its true depreciated value, which she confidently stated was about $20,000, or I could hand the keys over to Stephen for 3 days a week so he could build self-esteem and feel what it was like to work for something rewarding. I stared at her in silence, not because I was shocked anymore, but because I was truly curious whether she believed her own nonsense or had simply abandoned reality altogether. Stephen chimed in with his usual sad, frustrated tone and said he'd earned it by being patient, by staying in the neighborhood when I made things toxic, and by doing manifestation work. It took everything in me not to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I asked them politely to leave and reminded them that they were trespassing yet again. That didn't go over well. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she hissed under her breath that people like me always thought they were better than everyone else, and that the only reason I had the success I did was because I probably cheated or knew someone in tech. She said, "No normal person works hard and buys a Lamborghini." I responded simply that she didn't know anything about what it took to build something from the ground up, and that it wasn't my job to make her son feel better about his life. She started to argue again, raising her voice just as I raised my phone and made another call. Karen's expression shifted immediately when I mentioned Officer Peterson's name and said she might want to head over. Karen tried to retreat, grabbing Stephen by the wrist, but it was too late. A police cruiser was already turning the corner. Officer Peterson pulled up with a look of quiet resolve and stepped out of her vehicle. She listened as I recounted the morning's events, and then turned to Karen and Stephen with folded arms and a firm expression. Karen tried to downplay the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming they were just trying to negotiate community harmony, but Officer Peterson didn't buy it. She pointed out that this was the third time they had blocked my property, the second time they had made demands involving my car, and that combined with the prior police reports and security footage, their behavior was now being classified as harassment and attempted extortion. Karen lost it at that word, screaming that she was the real victim and accusing me of manipulating everyone in the neighborhood. Stephen, visibly panicking, started crying again, claiming he didn't mean to cause trouble and that he just wanted to feel what success felt like. As Officer Peterson explained that formal charges were going to be filed and that they would need to step away from my property immediately, Stephen broke down entirely. He dropped to his knees in my yard and began wailing like a child, clutching the grass and shouting that he deserved the car, that the world had been unfair to him, and that no one ever gave him a chance. It would have been sad if it weren't so disturbing. Karen tried to comfort him, then turned on me again, screaming about discrimination and injustice and how I'd ruined their reputation. Officer Peterson escorted them both off my property and warned that if they returned, further action would be taken. I thanked her, then walked slowly back into my house, the sound of Stephen's sobs still faintly echoing behind me. Over the next week, things moved quickly. The footage, the reports, and the testimony from other neighbors, many of whom had finally come forward with their own stories of being harassed by Karen, led to charges being officially filed. Stephen was cited for attempted theft and vandalism, and Karen for harassment, false complaints, and attempted coercion. The HOA board, under pressure from nearly every resident on the street, held an emergency vote to remove Karen from any position of authority. The vote was unanimous. Within days, a moving truck appeared in front of her house. Apparently, between the legal bills and the complete collapse of her reputation, she decided it was time for a new start somewhere else. Stephen, according to gossip from the neighbor's teenager, had moved into a shared apartment with a friend in a nearby city and had actually gotten a job at a local car wash. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As for me, I finally felt the peace I had been chasing when I bought this house. No more staring across the street, waiting for the next episode of Karen's Daily Breakdown. No more worrying that my property would be vandalized for daring to own something valuable. 6 weeks after they left, I hosted another community gathering. This time, it felt different. The air was lighter. Neighbors brought food and music. Kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and the Lamborghini, it sat quietly in the driveway, admired not as a target of envy, but as a symbol of resilience. I didn't flaunt it, and I didn't lock it away either. I just let it be part of the day, part of the neighborhood, part of a story that had finally reached its end, a neighborhood that no longer bowed to people like Karen.